Hello, and welcome to the newest episode of the New Stack Makers podcast. This week we are recording and live streaming direct from the KubeCon+CloudNativeCon show floor in Barcelona. And today we're talking about open source communities, how they've changed over the years, and what's the current state of open source communities. And we have three excellent guests. We have Bridget Kromhout from Microsoft. We also have a couple folks from Oracle. Karthik, Gaekwad. Am I pronouncing that right?
That's good.
All right, excellent. And Kaslin Fields, also a Solutions Architect from Oracle.
Yeah.
All right, fantastic, fantastic. What is, I guess let's jump right into the main question. Open source has always thrived by community. It grew up through the power of community, but there's a lot of different forces at play these days, especially in the enterprise software world. So how would you guys characterize the current state of open source communities? How healthy are they?
Want to go first?
I really think that you're looking at it. I mean, Microsoft and Oracle together at last with chocolate and peanut butter. But seriously, folks, like I feel like that metaphorical rising tide that lifts all boats, like that is so true in the open source world. And we build much better software collaborating and playing together in this space than we do being like everyone's kind of entrenched in their enterprise silos.
Certainly true. Kind of what open source is all about. And with so many companies these days adopting open source, it's becoming so mainstream even in enterprise companies. It's great to see how all of the companies end up working together to create these awesome projects together.
Yeah, I think, so Bob Quillen is going to talk about this in his keynote tomorrow, but one thing we've started to, I don't know if pivot is the right word, but, kind of merge towards is this idea of openness. And, it's not about looking at code bases that are, that are siloed away or that are hidden away from by companies which are enterprisey, but it's kind of all in GitHub today, so you can kind of go and look at code bases, and they're just open source code bases. And I think that's been one of the huge steps, which is different from like when I started in industry 15 years ago, where you'd find Java code and the Java code base online, but you wouldn't really find anything other than that was open source. And today you look at take KubeCon for example, you just have all these projects that you can just go look up the source code for.
And Karthik makes such a good point that just putting some source code out there isn't enough to be community, because we've all tried to use that project that seemed great, but the docs didn't make any sense, and maybe the install scripts didn't work, and the forums were empty, and like the issues were going unremarked upon, and you're thinking, do I want to use this even as a personal project? Well, maybe if I want to play with it. But then back to the question of enterprise. If you're an enterprise end user, really you're going to have a lot of pushback in your organization if you want to use a project that doesn't have an active community.
Yeah, definitely true.
That's an interesting point. That's so it's not just about having the code online, and I've experienced that as well. I had an XML parser that was a nightmare. It was open source, it was free, but it has to be the community has to thrive. So what makes a thriving community? What makes a robust community?
Well, I think we had a great keynote this morning. If you missed that, probably check out the recording of it. Lucas and Nikita gave great stories about how they got involved with the open source community and why they stayed in the open source community. And I think a lot of what makes a community thrive is having people want to help each other. It's not just about the technology, it's about people working together to do something. So like Lucas said in his keynote, he came for the technology because he wanted to run Kubernetes on ARM, and he had trouble doing that, but he ended up staying because he found so many cool people that he enjoyed working with and talking to. So,
and I think Nikita also made a point about that there's a lot of contributions across all these projects. And so you may or may not be writing that one fundamental component of the stack. Sure, maybe you are, and that's great. But you probably also are going to want someone in the project who is encouraging new members, or someone in the project who is telling the story of the project so that other people get excited about it. Because you're not going to really thrive or get a lot of adoption, especially in, say, an enterprise that would very much like to see your due diligence around security, and they would very much like to see your documentation. It's like all of those components are really important to making sure adoption is feasible.
Right. I'm hearing it's also like people over software. So, we value our interactions with, others. Both Nikita and Lucas are, newer to industry. And one of the coolest things that I got out of the session was that, they talked about mentorship and the idea that, you're starting new in industry, coming in, you're working in open source, but you also have folks that can kind of help you, take those steps to, become a better developer and, become, a contributor to open source. And I think that's great. One thing that I've noticed from my experiences in Austin specifically, it's, Kubernetes is more of a community based around, we have the conferences like KubeCon. We also have meetups and stuff like that, but it's more virtual. But when you're trying to build physical community, it's very similar because you value those interactions. So you go to like a DevOps Days Austin or DevOps Days Minneapolis because you want to talk to your friends, and they're like, I classify them not as developers but like friends of mine that I go to hang out and understand what they're doing with their roles and different things that they're doing in industry as well. So it's more about like you value your relationships.
And I think that's really key too, because a lot of people are probably going to watch this and be excited and also having FOMO because they weren't in Barcelona, which Barcelona is wonderful, and I recommend visiting it if you get a chance. But even in every single local community, you probably have a meetup, perhaps dormant, that you could propose a talk at. As someone who runs a local meetup, and I suspect you're in the same boat, spoiler alert, they need to talk every month. And they don't want it to be themselves every month. And they don't want it to be them and the other organizers on a panel every month. So like getting out there and sharing your experiences is part of participating in this wider community.
Yeah, and a lot of times, Kaslin, you probably have these experiences in Seattle as well, but like it's not just technology that you want to talk about. You also like your use cases are important, like how you go about solving different problems. Because folks are really interested in like wanting to understand whether they're doing the right thing or whether the road that they're walking on is not necessarily like an unpaved road. They want to see similar examples. So you help build like a culture of openness in your own cities or communities too.
Yeah, and that reminds me also of something that Bridget said earlier about the diversity of people that it takes to run these communities. It takes all sorts of different skills, all sorts of different backgrounds. And like I was in the contributor summit yesterday, and we were talking about how it takes so many people to run Kubernetes. It takes people who are writing the code, people who are PMing the releases, making sure that everything goes smoothly, people who are writing docs, helping make marketing materials like videos and blogs and things like that. So it takes all sorts of different skill sets and backgrounds to be able to make these projects work. And it's not just about being able to do code. You can have use cases, code, all sorts of different things at meetups. People care about all of it.
And it's one of the things that we've noticed too, both in meetups and in DevOps Days. I know we just ran into each other at DevOps Days Seattle. And you've been running DevOps Days Austin for a long time. And like these are much smaller than KubeCon, several hundred person local events. But most of the people attend, they watch sessions and they get some ideas. And then they go to open space attendee directed breakout sessions to talk to each other. And that's kind of the equivalent of a hallway track, but formalized. And I think anytime you're having a local event, a meetup, any kind of conference, encourage birds of feather sessions, lean coffee, whatever you want to call it, encouraging people to share and their experiences and talk with each other and just find out who is maybe a little bit further down the road that they are about to trod and find out what does the pavement look like? And is that bridge actually okay? Where's the bridge out?
That was my first DevOps Days, and I thought that part was absolutely amazing.
Yeah, I know the local meetups do a lot of the heavy lifting for communities, because not everybody has the time or the money or really even the interest to travel to another part of the country to learn about a particular technology. Something I'm very curious about, since we have representatives from both Microsoft and Oracle, is how open source is, how it plays out within a large company, within a large software vendor. Well, first of all, maybe we should start talking. What is the value that an Oracle or Microsoft size company brings to the end user, the enterprise user for open source?
I mean, I think we all have opinions on that, but I guess I will say in a general context, if you're a large enterprise, and I'm going to look right at the camera and say, if you work at a large enterprise and you benefit from open source, you should be employing and paying some contributors to open source. Because if you think about it, that's how you keep your interests represented and how you keep the open source projects on track. So I think we're 20 years into open source, and I think we've pretty much figured out that it's great for business, and it also is really important for businesses that rely on it to also support it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you mentioned having contributors from outside the company also contribute back to whatever open source project that they're using, and that's really important because we at Oracle or we at Microsoft might have like a certain view on how something should look like, but we kind of, the whole point of open source is actually building like the best possible platform or best possible product out there, and different perspectives is really helpful from that point of view. And so totally agree with your perspective on actually having folks that are using open source also contributing back, but doing it on company time versus doing it outside.
Yeah. And personal projects are great, but I don't think that the corporate world needs a whole bunch of handouts from people's spare time. Like, come on, no, pay them.
Yeah, definitely true. And all of that also reminds me of, like, I've been doing some customer visits in the Seattle area, and the marketing people and the sales people who work with these customers, oftentimes the customers are kind of suspicious of, like, Oracle's really doing open source? Is that a real thing? Why would you do that? And everyone is learning together that open source is really, really good for everyone. We know that our customers want to use it. We want to use it. We want to enable our customers to do what's best for them. So we want to support these open source projects, not just for us, but because it's good for our customers too.
And I think it's important for us to realize too, and to be honest about the fact that we work at giant capitalist enterprises. We absolutely are not doing open source as a charitable donation. It is very good for business to have the credibility and to have your oar in, or your skin in the game, or however you want to put it, in terms of you're actually participating. You're not just consuming. And we actually see this in end user companies. I mean, we all have end user companies we work with where there are contributors from the end user company who are on those projects because they have a vested interest in making sure that they go well. And, like, that's great. Yeah. And there's also, I'm going to put a plug in for an open source project that I'm involved with, Helm. We actually have one of the great independent contributors, independent consultant, Josh Delitsky actually works on the Helm project extensively and is in the Chicago-Milwaukee megalopolis, mega city one that's like growing by Chicago and Milwaukee. I don't know which one he lives in, but he's going to be coming up from there to Minneapolis to give a talk about Helm at our local meetup. And it's like, I mean, obviously, like, this is the kind of cross-pollination of ideas from your local community to your open source contributor communities to the corporate supported stuff. I think we need to just keep doing.
Yeah, and we see similar stuff. Like, we have a project called Project Helidon, which is a microservices framework, and so the basic, all the basics of the project are open source. And one of the most interesting things that we are seeing is when people actually start using it and start filing bugs and talking about different ideas for that specific project, we get a whole bunch of things like, this should actually be on the roadmap, or this should actually we should change the product or project direction, in specific ways for how people actually use it versus, how we hypothesize for how people might want to use it. Instead, you probably see.
Yeah. The roadmap discussions are always an interesting hybrid of, vested interests and very important voices, and there's always going to be a complex discussion of exactly how things get prioritized. Yep. But if you have good insights into how your community of end users are actually behaving. Like, I mean, that's the kind of thing, like the Helm project I mentioned, which is a CNCF project now and is a package manager for Kubernetes. The Helm 3 release that is going to be is in alpha now is very different in that it no longer has the server-side component, Tiller, that was in the project, introduced in Helm 2. And they're actually taking it out. And I think this is one of those things where you listen to the community and you find out that, the role-based access control model in Kubernetes has matured and changed over time. We don't actually need this, and it's adding unnecessary complexity. And I think one of the hardest things in any kind of large sprawling community project is editing. Like, adding things is fine, do it, but taking things out is a lot of work and hard. Yeah. But again, listening to the feedback of the open source community is why the Helm project put in the effort to actually edit out a piece of unnecessary complexity.
And there was a huge cheer in the keynote this morning.
Yeah, I was about to say.
When they announced that.
Everybody was hating on Tiller for some reason.
I don't even think it's hating on. I think it's a little more complex than that, right? Like a component that serves a purpose, sure, it's great. Then when it's not serving the purpose so well anymore and instead it's adding unnecessary weight and complexity, then you sometimes in many, I suppose, corporate endeavors, you might just sit there saying, I don't like this, but we're stuck with it. And I think it's really nice that in the open source community, they were able to say, you know what, we're not stuck with it, and we can put the extra work into simplifying the model for all of the end users.
Yeah, and I find it really interesting how all of this kind of goes with a lot of the things I've been reading lately about the advocacy role that has become so popular in recent years, which is all about interacting with the community from within the company and then bringing those insights from the community back into the company. It's a role itself that kind of does that. And then that itself is part of open source because you're all working together and collaborating from your different perspectives. And I feel like advocacy is kind of like the human version of that now. I had never thought about that before, but I think that's pretty cool.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's an entire ecosystem there for sure. Every maintainer and everyone who runs a SIG, everyone who runs a mailing list, everyone who does any of these activities that I was happy to see highlighted in the keynote this morning. But it's like these are all ways that we make working together better.
So if you have a new project and you don't yet have a community, what are some of the things, you mentioned some of them, but what are some of the things you can do to help grow the community? Maybe you have some users but they're not really formally interacting with you.
Sure. I think like the recipe that I've seen a lot of open source projects use is, the code is in GitHub, but like we mentioned before, it's not just about the code. GitHub is kind of used for, having your source control, also has issues. It's really good to have like a Slack community because you might have your, initial users that are trying to figure out, hey, how do I just get this thing to work? So docs are important from a side thing, but just being able to, actually live talk to people is huge because and I think that's one of the reasons why Kubernetes took off so quickly because it wasn't some kind of user forum group that you go and send your question to and go to bed and come back the next morning and have 30 responses and you type something and you wait 12 hours to get another response. It's a lot more live feedback, and I think Slack is really good for that, and Kubernetes does it super well because you have the different SIGs, so the advanced users have their own forum to talk about whatever issues or whatever they want to talk about, and you also have new users coming in where you can ask the one-on-one kind of questions, and you're empowered to do that, and it's pretty huge.
We should gloss SIGs for new users. These are special interest groups, and that phrase is not unique in any way to Kubernetes, but Kubernetes, I think, implements them pretty well.
And something that you were talking about there, I forgot what it was. What were we just talking about? SIGs and...
SIGs and new users coming in.
Oh, yes. So that was a lot of things, which is why I forgot what I was going to say. And I thought it would be important to point out that is a lot of things and a lot of work. So you have to have, oftentimes in open source communities, you have a lot of different people that are helping run all of these different initiatives to help get the whole community involved. And to get a new community started with very few people, you've got to know that you're going to be wearing a lot of hats. And you're going to have to be putting in a lot of work to be able to get these communities going. You've got to get Slack channels going. You've got to go to meetups. There's all these different venues that you can take. So you've got to pick a few and wear the hats that you can wear.
What I would say to that is most of the people who are paying attention to this particular information stream are into computers in some way. And we do a decent job of computery things like, say, building distributed systems that are fault tolerant. And I think that's really hard to do from a human point of view. And if you are the single point of failure of your project is probably doomed. Because at some point you're going to go on vacation, or at some point you're going to get sick, or at some point you're going to change jobs to one where you have no spare time. So like I would say the base level of starting any project is you better distribute your knowledge base and your power base to some extent, because otherwise it's you. It's a personal project, and that's fine, but you're probably not going to be able to scale if no one else can do the build, or if no one else can cut a release, if no one else can approve pull requests. Like, whatever it is that you're holding on to, find somebody that you trust enough and distribute that power, because that's how you grow.
And that seems like that would be a shift for the open source community. A lot of the original projects, I'm thinking of NTP or OpenSSH, or start out as one or two projects. Yeah.
But you better grow to more, or I mean, we've seen what happens to some projects if they aren't funded and staffed, and somebody burns out. And
you could literally break the internet if your particular project is not supported and it's used everywhere.
Yeah, and you can take Jenkins is a great example, where it was a small team initially, and you look at it now, it's a company, and there's like millions of users actually like using Jenkins and also contributing back to it. It's huge.
And in the community side, since we mentioned DevOps Days earlier, I'll say I am the global head of the DevOps Days organization. You can look at devopsdays.org and see that I think we had 70 cities worldwide last year. I didn't go, I think I went to about half of that many conferences last year, and most of them weren't DevOps Days. And that's still way too many conferences for a reasonable individual, I will say that. But when you want to grow from, this year's the 10th anniversary of that conference, I didn't start it. I wasn't in the pioneers, if we're going to go with pioneers, settlers, town planners, like I wasn't coming in as a pioneer. I came in running the organization 5 years in and scaled it up. And I think that if you want to scale something, you need docs, and you need the ability to give people enough space to make it their own.
Yep.
And you folks were running Austin before I even started running Minneapolis. So like from your point of view, you run things a little bit differently than some other folks, but you can scale up, scale down, change focus, make it your own. And I think that that's how projects can grow.
Yeah, and to kind of draw parallels, for us, like one of the secrets for DevOps Days Austin is we actually have, there's not one person that's a single point of failure. Our organization crew is like a crew of 15 to 17 people, and then we have like 20, 30 volunteers like every year. So that's like a crew of 50 folks actually running a conference of 400 folks or whatever we decide from a year-to-year basis. And the greatest thing about that is everybody in our organization team and our volunteer team can actually go and like enjoy the conference. So it's not, to us, it's not a job. Like, oh, I got to run this conference. Man, I'm really like, I got to do all the stuff. But it's like you do one specific role, and then you're empowered to go and, enjoy the rest of the time. And the conference, go and learn, because we come together because we want to be learning and doing things that are interesting to us from, a technology perspective, and not be drawn down to, hey, is there enough food for like everybody at the, at the meetup today or at the conference today? So it's really important. It's really important to, keep it, from a large scale.
Yeah. Well, and I will say that the Minneapolis DevOps meetup ran at 1 a.m. Barcelona time this morning, which, was it yesterday? I've lost track of days. No, it was this morning. Today's Tuesday, right?
I think so.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, and so because, I'm not a single point of failure, we actually merged for this month with a new serverless meetup in town to kind of help them kick off. So, like, we basically just posted it on our meetup and said RSVP to theirs. And then we had our people there. And we also had a lot of our attendees, showed up to that. And I feel like that's another piece of community that is really important, whether it's the cross-organizational collaboration, the collaboration on an open source project, or you're a pretty established meetup and you're going to get a new meetup off the ground by sending your people to it.
So DevOps Days, that's not a commercial series of conferences? I'm not that familiar.
Oh, no, it's non-commercial. Yeah, they're all, it's basically like a distributed system that has nodes everywhere and has very loose consensus control.
Huh.
So,
like you get a template, and so you get a template for how you should run your conference, but you're not. There's some rules in there that you should follow, but a lot of them are.
Yeah, I mean, there's some rules that, like in 2014, Andrew Clay Schaefer added a code of conduct to DevOps Days Pittsburgh, and that was the first DevOps Days that had such a thing. And when I took over running the org at the beginning of 2015, I was like, hey, that's a great idea. We literally put it in the template so that when people instantiate a new event with the janky bash script that I wrote, they would get that. And we'd be like, hey, this is the standard expectations. And I feel like that's a good way to guide people, give them, these are your guardrails.
Yep.
We're not going to have and this in any open source project too, we're not going to have super strict, you must follow these 60 bullet points, because no one really wants to join a project where they have to spend all their time worrying about, am I doing it wrong? But like, have very clear guardrails of, this is what we do in this community, this is how many people sign off on a pull request, or this is what you have to do to launch a new event. In the case of these events, all right, you have a video chat with an organizer from, the global core team that we've grown over the years, and make sure that you're okay with, we're non-commercial, yada, yada, yada. And as long as you're okay with that, like, here's the guidelines, here's the template. We recommend you go with the standard template to start with, but then iterate on it.
Yep.
Is that a good rule of thumb for open source projects as well? Just kind of the loose kind of control?
I mean, every project's going to be different, but I think that you've probably seen it. I know we've seen that there are some things you're going to probably have to have. Like, I like when you have automation on your issue life cycles. Like, if an issue has been neglected, perhaps do we want to update it or do we want to close it because we're not going to work on it? Like, different projects handle that sort of thing differently. But I think it's a good idea to be really clear about, if you want to be a contributor, this is how you get a commit bit. Like, making that stuff out in the open, not making it a secret and only if you're pals with so-and-so, I think that's pretty useful.
And I think something interesting about whether you're applying this to open source communities or to DevOps Days, but to specifically talk about DevOps Days, I consistently hear from people that DevOps Days events are some of the best conferences that they go to. And there's so many of them, and they're so distributed. Even though they have kind of this loose method of kind of organization, like making sure that each one is similar, I still hear consistently, no matter which DevOps Days it is, that DevOps Days conferences are great.
But here's what I think what people are getting at with that is not even necessarily unique to that specific conference series, because that conference series emphasizes, again, community, it emphasizes the open space attendee-directed breakout groups are given a formal place in the schedule. And I think that allows the attendees to create their own conference that they want, the discussions they want to have, more so than you'll get at many events where you're just hallway tracking. Like, formalizing that we want you to talk to each other and learn from each other, I think is one of the things people really end up valuing.
That looseness and adaptability is probably part of why DevOps Days is so successful. If you took a one-size-fits-all approach to running these conferences, it might not be as successful as it is with this kind of leeway that the community can use to fit the conference to what they need.
Yeah, I always like it because at DevOps Days events specifically, I feel empowered to go and actually talk to a speaker. Sometimes at other conferences, I'm like, man, there's like 1,000 people in this room, and I'm sitting in the last row, and that speaker knows what they're talking about, and I'm like kind of scared to go talk to them. But, in a smaller setting and with open spaces where everybody's kind of sharing their own journey or their own story, you're actually empowered to be able to, have conversation with not just the speaker, but everybody else around you too. So it helps you like build a community around everybody that's there in the room.
I think when you're talking about those communities online too, that idea of being welcoming and of saying that everyone's voice can be heard is, I think it's really important that in your docs and in your GitHub repos and in all of the public-facing communications, even in your error messages, in your public-facing communications that someone is going to experience when they encounter your project, if they get this impression that they will be heard and people will care if they say, I had this problem. Like that means a lot. I mean, this is the sticky human parts of tech is if it looks like no one's going to care if you report this bug, are you gonna? Right. Are you gonna hit submit on that issue?
Yeah, it almost like for some reason my brain trailed off and I was like, this is very similar to, having like autocratic or somebody ruling over everything and setting all the laws and guidelines or laws and rules for everything versus more for democracy where you have, people coming to a consensus on different topics. So like mapping it back to real world, like it used to be more like, hey, a company would set direction. They would basically tell you what was coming up. But now in a more open source world, like on the Oracle side with like Helidon and GraalVM and stuff like that, where it's like everyone kind of works together to, get to the point that they want to get to.
We saw that today also with the merger of Open Census and Open Tracing, and I asked both of the project leaders, and they both said that, it was causing confusion for the users. Which one do I use? I don't know. I'm not going to do anything. And so that was a case where they actually listened to the feedback that they were getting about them and about, I wouldn't say competitors, they're not making any money, but a directly parallel project.
I think you bring up a really interesting point, and this is germane to how the large enterprise software companies and clouds collaborate, which is to say our competitors aren't necessarily each other so much as they are, let's just stay in the data center for another year or two. And so if you're making the paralysis of choice worse by undercutting the competitors and making it confusing for the end user, that doesn't make them pick you. That makes them pick nothing. So having good, clear offerings and good, clear collaboration makes the end user realize that whatever they choose, it's going to be okay because they'll be able to use everything they need to because they're using open source anyway. So they're not going to feel trapped or like their options have been limited, and instead they'll feel empowered, which is great from the point of view of people who would like to serve those markets.
Yeah, keeping things visible is always like a good strategy because you can see what's there, what's coming, what was there before, and so it keeps everything like open and up, like out in the open.
Reminds me of those customer meetings again where the customers are like, why are you really doing this?
Yeah.
And are you really doing this? Yes, we are. And it's important to us and it's important to you. And we know that. And it's all good.
Awesome.
Terrific. So I'm hearing empowerment, visibility, involvement. These are all kind of things you need to build a successful open source community. To wrap up this podcast, any other things that we should mention?
One thing I was thinking of was buzzword bingo. We went through a lot of buzzword bingo today, but it's all really important buzzwords. Adaptability and enabling people to do things that make them excited and being able to work with other people and not have them be the core point of failure is really important. Some of the main things I got out of today.
And today, for some reason, our conversation made me think of the book by Kathy Sierra called Badass, where she makes the point that, and there was a subtitle as well, but you can find it with that. And the point that Kathy Sierra is making there is that your end users are not sitting there thinking, software, gosh, I really want to use some software today. No, they're trying to accomplish their goals. And so everyone wins when you focus on helping them accomplish their goals.
Yeah, that's super true. And I have the cough. I think the one thing I want to say from somebody coming into like a new community too is it's okay to like ask the questions even if you think that they're really dumb. It's okay to ask that on, whatever forums you have, because that's how you get started. You're day one, you're never an expert. You're walking the path. So it's learn always like crawl, walk. You crawl before you walk. So it's okay to like start wherever you're starting and be empowered to feel like the community that you're joining up is like a community that's welcoming.
And if they don't welcome you, that's a warning sign right there.
That's a signal right there. And I will add to what Karthik said that if you have the newbie superpower of being able to read those docs with a fresh eye, please don't waste it. Please open the issue, because I assure you the maintainers of that project will be so grateful. They will not be angry at you for not understanding what they meant. They'll be thrilled that you helped them change the docs such that it actually communicates what they wanted it to. And they don't have the ability anymore to do that. They don't. So only the people who are looking at a project for the first time actually can open the issues that are going to solve things.
All right. Well, I thank you all for taking time to talk with us, and I thank the listeners and viewers out there in video land, and we'll see you soon again on the new Stack Makers.